Texas, 1873. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and by the time Margaret Clevin stood alone in her wedding dress on the muddy road outside the church in Kerrville, the hem was soaked through and clinging to her ankles like regret. People had already gone back inside. The preacher, the guests, even the fiddler, all of them too uncomfortable to stand in the wet any longer. But Margaret could not move. She just kept staring down the road, the one her groom was supposed to ride up before noon. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon now. The storm rolled low and heavy above her, and mud slicked every inch of the red clay road behind the church. He was not coming. Her chest ached with the kind of pain that made it hard to breathe. She had spent a year believing in his promises. Letters every week. A carved comb he sent from Abilene. He had said he would build her a home with his own hands. Instead, he left her standing in the rain with his name on her lips and a church full of eyes behind her. She turned, slow and hollow, and took a step toward the church doors. Her boot slid out from under her in the mud, and she dropped hard onto her side, the white fabric tearing at the sleeve, her bouquet crushed beneath her. "Whoa there, ma'am." A man's voice, low and sharp, cut through the sound of the rain. She blinked up at him, dazed. He had dismounted fast, his horse still shifting behind him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked like the rest of the world, but his eyes were clear and steady, a strange kind of calm in them. "Easy," he said, stepping carefully through the mud. "Give me your arm." She hesitated. She had not moved since she fell. "I am not trying to take anything from you," he said, gentler now. "Just let me help you up." She looked at his hand, then at the church doors, then back at the road that stayed empty. When her fingers finally reached for his grip was warm and sure. He helped her to her feet, like she weighed nothing at all. She stumbled once, but he caught her by the waist. "You all right?" he asked. Margaret nodded, swallowing thickly. Yes. Thank you." He glanced toward the church, then back at her. "You waiting for someone?" She looked away. He did not press her. Instead, he took off his coat and held it out to her. "You are shaking." She stared at it for a moment before taking it. It was rough wool, smelled faintly of leather and horse, but warm. She wrapped it around herself and let herself breathe. "What is your name?" she asked. "Rhett Gallan," he said, tipping his hat. "I was passing through. Thought maybe I could stable my horse here for a bit. Wait out the rain." She nodded. Margaret Clevin. His gaze flicked to the torn dress, the way her hair clung to her face, the bouquet half dragged in the mud. But he did not ask. Instead, he said, "You want to sit somewhere dry?" She nodded again, and he guided her toward the church doors. She caught the way he kept his hand near her waist, not touching, but there if she wavered. Inside, the air was warm and lit by oil lamps. Most of the guests had filtered into the back hall. The preacher looked up, startled to see her return with a stranger. She ignored them all. Rhett steered her to a bench near the front and sat beside her, quiet. "I do not know why he did not come," she said after a long silence. "He wrote every week. He said he loved me, that he was coming to marry me, that he had money saved, land even." Rhett's jaw tightened, but he stayed still beside her. "I waited since morning," she said. "I still hoped up until the moment my knees hit the mud." "You should not be out there alone," Rhett said. "Not in this weather. Not like that." She glanced sideways. "Would it make you feel better if I told you I was waiting for a man who loved me?" "No," he said, "but I would not have let you fall if it had been me." That made her throat tighten. She shifted her gaze back to the pew in front of them. He stood then, slow and deliberate. "Come on. You need dry clothes. Somewhere quiet." "I cannot go back to my father's house," she said quickly. "He said if I went through with this, if I married someone like Nathan, he would not welcome me back." Rhett studied her. "You want to come with me? I do not even know you. I am not asking anything from you, Margaret. Just offering a place to dry off, get warm. I have a little cabin out west, near Medina River. You can stay a day or two until you figure things out." She looked down at her mud-streaked dress. "You would do that for a stranger?" "I saw you fall," he said simply. "That is enough." She nodded slowly. They left the church together under the waning rain, walking side by side as Rhett led his horse and steadied her with a hand at her back. She did not look behind her once. They rode through the last stretch of the storm, the sun breaking through the clouds as they neared the hills. Rhett's cabin was small but clean, with a wooden porch and smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, he gave her a blanket and stoked the fire. She changed into one of his shirts behind the curtain strung up in the corner. It hung past her knees, and she felt both safer and more exposed than she ever had. When she stepped out, he looked up from where he knelt by the stove and paused. "You all right?" he asked again, voice softer this time. "I will be," she answered. He nodded once, then turned back to the fire. She watched his shoulders move as he worked, steady and quiet. There was something different about him. Not just kindness, but something solid. Something she had not known she needed. And when he handed her a plate of cornbread and stew, his fingers brushed hers. Neither of them said anything about it, but the touch stayed with her long after she lay down on the cot and listened to the crackle of the fire. She had been left in the mud, but someone had taken her hand, lifted her to her feet, and brought her to shelter. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the ache in her chest ease, just a little. The wood walls creaked softly with the wind, and Margaret woke before dawn, the pale light of morning just beginning to press against the small window. The shirt she wore smelled faintly of pine smoke and saddle soap, and the quilt Rhett had tucked around her held the warmth of a fire long since burned low. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from the ride and the fall, and listened for movement. Nothing but the soft rustle of tree branches outside. The curtain that sectioned off the cot was still drawn, but she could hear the faint scrape of wood from the other room. She stepped out quietly. Rhett stood with his back to her, tying a bundle of kindling with twine. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, forearms dusted with ash. The stove behind him was open, and the faint glow of embers lit the edges of his face. "You always up this early?" she asked, her voice softer than she meant. He didn't turn. Most work waits for no one. "Do you need help?" He twisted the twine once more and set the bundle down. "I won't stop you." She crossed to the table, brushing her fingers over a tin cup left from the night before. "I don't know what I'm useful for at the moment." "You don't have to prove anything to me," he said, rising. "You're here. That's enough." She looked at him then. He wasn't smiling, but there was a steadiness in the way he held her gaze, like he knew what it meant to feel unmoored. "I used to help with the smokehouse back home," she said, "and I can mend. So, I mean, what about coffee?" he asked, gesturing to the pot on the stove. She lifted the lid, breathed in the bitter steam. "I can pour." He handed her 2 cups, and they sat at the table, steam rising between them. The silence wasn't uneasy, it settled around them like a wool blanket, heavy but not unwelcome. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked after a while. "Whatever's needed," he said. "Fencing, hauling, sometimes cattle drives. I don't stay in one place too long." "But you built this." He took a sip, then nodded. "I needed somewhere to come back to. Built it with my brother, before he took work up near Del Rio." She turned the cup in her hands. "Seems like you could stay put, if you wanted to." He didn't answer right away. Then, "Some men aren't made for stillness." Margaret looked down. "I used to think I was." He watched her quietly. "Want to walk a bit? There's a creek not far. You can see the cypress turning if the light's right." She hesitated. Her shoes were still damp from yesterday, but the thought of moving, of anything beyond the cabin walls, pulled at her. "I'll bring the boots," he said. They walked side by side through the thinning mist, the grass wet underfoot. The trail curved along a low ridge, and Rhett pointed out where wild turkeys had left tracks in the mud, where a doe had stepped through the brush. When they reached the creek, the water was clear and shallow, tumbling over smooth stones. The cypress trees lined the banks, their roots like knuckled hands gripping the earth. Margaret stood at the edge, wrapping her arms around herself. "I thought I knew what my life would be." He crouched beside the water, tossing a small branch into the current. "What was it going to be?" "Simple," she said. "A garden, maybe chickens. A man who came home at the end of the day. You still want that?" She didn't answer right away. "I think I want something honest." Rhett stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "That's rarer than folks admit." She turned to him. "Have you ever been in love?" His brow furrowed slightly. "Once. A long time back. She married someone else." "Did it hurt?" "Not the way you'd think," he said. "It was more like something slipped off my shoulders. Like I could finally stop trying to be the man she wanted." Margaret nodded, then looked out at the water again. "Do you want to go back to town?" he asked. She thought about the church doors, the pitying looks, the hush that followed her name. No, he didn't press her. They walked back slowly, and by the time they reached the cabin, the sun had warmed the porch. Margaret sat on the top step, letting the light dry the damp hem of her borrowed shirt. Rhett leaned against the post beside her. I'll need to ride into the settlement tomorrow. Supplies are low. She looked up. How far? Half a day there and back. Can I come? He studied her face. You sure you're ready? I need to do something that isn't waiting. He nodded once. We leave at first light. She stood, brushing off her skirt. Then I'll make supper. He watched her cross the room, her steps steadier than they'd been the night before. Something shifted behind his eyes, not quite surprise, but close to it. The wind outside had settled, and the quiet that followed felt new. Inside the small cabin, Margaret stirred beans into a pot and set the bread to rise. Rhett chopped wood behind the house, the rhythmic sound of the axe striking steady and sure. The ache in her chest hadn't vanished, but a different kind of weight had started to root in its place, something still unnamed, but steady, and she did not feel alone in it. The road to Bandera was hard-packed and rutted, winding through cedar breaks and limestone outcrops that glinted pale in the morning sun. Margaret rode behind Rhett. Seated on a gelding, he called Larkspur an older horse, sturdy and mild-tempered. She wore a faded calico blouse he'd found in a trunk, along with a pair of trousers that hung loose at the waist but stayed put under a length of cord. She hadn't ridden in men's clothes before, but the freedom of it surprised her. Rhett rode ahead, quiet as always, but she caught him looking back every now and again, just long enough to check her seat or offer a nod when the path narrowed. They reached the edge of town, close to midday. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed down the main street. A few wagons were parked outside the general store, and voices drifted from the saloon across the road. Rhett dismounted first and tied off both horses. Stay close, he said, lowering his voice. Folk don't forget faces fast in small towns. She stepped down carefully, brushing road dust from her sleeves. I'm not afraid of whispers. He didn't argue, only held the door open as she stepped into the store, the bell above it giving a single, high chime. Inside, the air smelled of flour and kerosene. Shelves rose high with sacks of meal, jars of preserves, and coils of rope. A man behind the counter looked up, adjusting his spectacles. Gallan, been a while. Need beans, salt, and beeswax. 2 pounds of coffee if you've got it. The man nodded, reaching for a ledger. His eyes drifted to Margaret, lingered a second too long. And the lady? She's with me. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. Margaret stepped away, letting her fingers trail over a bolt of muslin. You always come here for supplies? Only when I have to, Rhett said behind her. Prices are better at the trading post near Hondo, but this is closer. She turned to him. There's a saddle blanket with embroidery near the door. Someone made that by hand. He didn't glance over. Most things worth keeping are. They walked the shelves together, silently dividing what was needed from what could wait. She added a tin of lye soap and a spool of thread to the pile. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters slightly. Rhett paid in coins, thanked the man with a nod, and lifted the sack to his shoulder. They stepped back into the street. Margaret blinked at the sudden brightness. You all right? He asked, adjusting the weight of the sack. I am. She hesitated. Could we walk a little before heading back? He looked toward the end of the street, where the river forked past a stand of cottonwoods. All right. They walked in silence for a stretch, the town falling behind them. The path sloped down to the river's edge, and they followed a narrow trail where water lapped against stones. Margaret stopped beside a sun-bleached log and sat. Rhett lowered the sack to the ground and leaned against a tree a few paces away. I used to come to the river when I needed to think, she said. Back home. There was a bend where the water slowed. He watched her, one hand resting on his belt. I think I stayed with Nathan's letters because they gave me something to hold, even when I knew he wasn't honest. Rhett didn't speak. I ignored the parts of him that didn't fit, she said quietly. And when he didn't come, I wasn't surprised. I was just ashamed I ever thought he might. The leaves shifted above them, and a crow called once from the far bank. You don't owe shame to anyone who lied to you, Rhett said. She looked up at him. What do you owe a person who tells the truth? He met her gaze. Respect, if they earn it. She stood then and crossed the space between them, slow and sure. You haven't asked anything of me. Not once. Why? Because you needed space to breathe, he said simply. And I didn't want to take that from you. Her fingers found the edge of his sleeve. "You've given me more than space." He didn't move, but his eyes softened, the hard lines around them easing. "You gave me something back, too." "What's that?" "The sound of someone else's boots on my porch." The ache that had lived in her chest since the church began to loosen, like a knot gently unraveling. When they rode back that afternoon, the sun was lower, throwing long shadows across the trail. Margaret rode beside Rhett this time. Neither of them hurried. At the cabin, she helped him unload the goods. By the time the fire was lit and the stew was cooking, the light had turned gold and slow. Later, as they sat near the hearth, she reached for his hand without hesitation. And this time, he didn't wait before lacing his fingers with hers. The air turned cooler as October settled over the hills, the days shorter, the nights deep with frost. Margaret rose early now, often before Rhett, tying her hair back with a strip of muslin and gathering kindling from the lean-to while the ground still held the night's chill. Each morning, she coaxed the fire to life and set water to boil, her hands moving with purpose. After breakfast, they worked side by side without needing to speak much. Rhett repaired the corral fencing where a cedar post had rotted through, and Margaret cleared the overgrown patch behind the cabin, the soil dark and soft beneath her fingers. She planted onions and winter squash from a seed sack he'd forgotten he even had, her skirts tucked into her boots, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. One evening, as dusk slipped in quiet and copper-colored over the hills, Margaret stood at the edge of the porch and watched the sky turn. Rhett sat nearby, sharpening a drawknife, his stroke slow and even against the blade. "I thought of something today," she said, her voice low. He looked up, waiting. I never knew what his voice sounded like in person. "Nathan." I only knew the way he wrote. Rhett set the blade aside. "What brought that on?" I was pulling weeds and realized I'd never once heard him laugh. Not even a memory of it. And I don't think I ever wondered until now. He didn't try to answer. She liked that about him. "I remember voices more than faces," she added. "My mother used to hum while she boiled linens. I can still hear that. You ever think about going back to your kin?" She turned toward him, arms crossed tight against the breeze. "My father was never a gentle man. He kept a ledger for everything: how many eggs I dropped, how long I cried after my mother passed. When I left, he told me not to come back unless I was married proper." Rhett leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't owe him anything." "I know, but I used to think if I could just be good enough, I might earn his kindness." He stood slowly, closing the blade and setting it on the rail. "You don't have to earn kindness. It's given, or it isn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "What about love?" "That's different," he said. "Love takes work, but it shouldn't be a debt." The last light faded behind the ridge. A whip-poor-will called from the trees. Rhett stepped off the porch, walking toward the shed. Margaret followed, her boots quiet on the packed earth. Inside, he lit the lantern and pulled down an oilskin bundle from the rafters. He untied it and unfolded a set of hand tools, each one polished, the handles worn smooth. "These were my brother's," he said. "He left them when he took work down south. Said I'd put them to better use." Margaret knelt beside the bench, running her fingers lightly over the plane and brace. "You ever think of building more than fence and roof?" He turned toward her. "What do you mean?" "A table, a cradle, a door that doesn't stick." He gave a small breath of a laugh. "You want a cradle?" She met his eyes. "Someday." Rhett nodded once, slow and steady, and she saw the thought settle in him like something firm taking shape. She rose and stepped closer, the scent of cedar sharp in the air between them. "You built this place with your hands," she said, "but you made room for me with your heart." He swallowed hard, his jaw working. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just until I figure things out. I want to build a life here with you." His fingers brushed hers, rough and warm. "Then we'll build it." She stepped into his arms, and for the first time in her life, there was no doubt in the embrace, no bargain, no silence to fill, no line she had to cross to be wanted. Later, as the lantern burned low and the night deepened around them, they stood in the doorway of the cabin, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the darkened land that would now be theirs. And when Margaret laid her head against Rhett's chest, listening to the even rhythm of his breath, she knew she had not been rescued, she had been chosen. Not out of pity, not out of chance, but because two steady hearts had found each other in the wide, hard country and decided not to let go. The frost settled heavier by late November, thin silver blooming across the windows before daybreak. Rhett nailed strips of canvas over the glass to keep the cabin warmer, and Margaret stitched flannel linings into their coats by lamplight. The rhythms between them had deepened not just in work, but in the quiet between words, in the way their hands found each other without needing to look. That morning, Rhett returned from clearing the trail behind the bluff with a fresh scrape across the back of his knuckles and a frown between his brows. "Found tracks," he said, setting the axe by the door. "Not deer. Bootprints. Could be someone passing through, but they circled near the goat pen." Margaret stood from the table, her needlework forgotten. "Could it be someone from Bandera? Too far off the road for that." He poured water into the basin and washed the blood from his hand. "We'll keep a lantern burning, just in case." She nodded once, then reached into the storage bin and handed him a tin of salve. "Let me," she said, and he held still while she pressed the ointment into his skin with gentle fingers. "She didn't take to you kindly," she added, voice quiet. "Rhett didn't ask who." "The shopkeeper's wife. She looked at me like I'd come in wearing shame." "You want to go back there?" "No," she said. "I just want to know if you're used to that." "I don't make much room for other people's judgments," he said, "but I see how they weigh on you." She tied a strip of cloth around his hand and looked up. "I don't want to carry them anymore." He held her gaze, then said, "Then don't. What you build here, what we build, it's not theirs to measure." The wind outside picked up, rattling the canvas at the windows. Margaret crossed to the stove and stirred a pot of barley, the warmth rising to her cheeks. That night, they kept the lantern on. Rhett sat near the window with his rifle resting on his knee, while Margaret read aloud from a worn book she'd found in the trunk beneath the bed Whitman, his words slow and strange, but rich in something that settled the room. By morning, the ground outside was undisturbed. No new tracks, no sign anyone had come closer. They spent the day mending the roof above the porch, shingling each board with care. Margaret held the ladder while Rhett worked. Later, she painted the new wood with leftover pitch, her hands blackened, her sleeves stiff with the stuff. "You ever miss the noise of town?" he asked from the roof, squinting into the sun. "I miss the library," she called back, "and the bell that rang for supper. But not much else." He grinned, then tapped the last nail into place. "Well, this porch won't creak anymore." That night, she reached for him in bed, not in need, not from fear, but because she wanted to feel his breath beside hers, steady and close. His arm curled around her back, and she pressed her face into the hollow of his shoulder. "You think we'll stay here always?" she whispered, her words barely brushing his skin. "I do," he said, "unless you want something else." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I want a garden that grows through winter. I want a life that doesn't flinch when it's looked at. Then we'll make both." Snow came early in December, light at first, then thick enough to blanket the cypress branches and hush the land. Rhett built a sled with oak runners, and they hauled firewood down from the ridge. Margaret made preserves from wild plums they'd dried in September, and she wrapped them in cloth to trade come spring. One evening, as the snow fell in slow, soft spirals, Rhett took something from the drawer beneath the bed, a ring, plain silver, with a small turquoise stone. "It was my mother's," he said, holding it out. "She didn't speak much, but she gave it to my brother before she passed. He gave it to me when he left." Margaret touched the band, then looked at him. "I don't have much in way of ceremony," he said, "but I have this. And I have you." She took the ring slowly, slid it onto her finger, and leaned into him, cheek against his chest. "Then I have everything I need." They married that Sunday, with only the river and the wind as witness. She wore the muslin dress she'd sewn from the bolt at the store, and Rhett stood beside her in his best shirt, the collar stiff from starch. They spoke their vows plainly, the way they spoke everything, without embellishment, but with truth. By late winter, Margaret's garden beds were ready. The squash had taken root beneath the straw mulch, and Rhett built a low fence to keep the hares out. She wrote letters to no one, not to send, but to say what had gone unsaid for years. She read them to the fire, then fed them to the flames. One morning, she found Rhett at the fence line, hat off, staring toward the ridge. When she stepped beside him, he didn't speak, just reached for her hand. "Another track?" she asked. "No," he said, "just the quiet. It's a good quiet." She leaned into his side. "It's home." He nodded, and they stood there until the sun rose full, casting long shadows behind them. Years passed. The cabin grew with them and added room for storage, a stone hearth Rhett built by hand. The land bore fruit in time, potatoes, beans, and a pair of goats that Margaret named after constellations. They kept bees, harvested wax and honey, and traded at the post in Hondo when the wagon was sound. They grew older, their hands calloused, their backs strong. The fence needed mending each spring, the roof patching after storms. But the work was theirs. Every evening, they sat on the porch when the light turned gold. Sometimes she read, sometimes he whittled. Most nights they simply sat, the quiet between them full of everything they'd built. And when they lay down at night, it was with the ease of two souls who had chosen each other, again and again, until no part of the world felt separate from the bond they'd made. Rhett and Margaret Gallan lived out their days in the hills above the Medina River, not in longing, not in fear, but in peace. The kind that's built slowly, with hands and heart, over seasons of honest work and steady love.